Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the presentation. Today, we're going to be talking about a subject that gets a lot of attention these days, mental health, but we're talking about it in a more expanded, really situation where we're going to talk about mental health and its effect on emotional well-being and cognitive health. So my name is Brian Brown. I'm the president of Cognitive Care Management. I work closely with the Alzheimer's Association, both locally and nationally. And it's my pleasure to be able to present this information to you. So we'll talk a little bit about the brain. The brain is the most metabolic organ in our entire body. 30% of all the oxygen that we breathe in and 30% of all the food that we eat go to power our brain. It's really, really metabolic. And that means that it requires a lot of energy to be able to perform all of its functions. It's really the powerhouse of our bodies that governs all of the things that we do. So all of the sensory data that come all from every aspect of our body, meaning when we stub our toes to when we have a fever to everything, the brain processes that information and governs our response to it. And the brain isn't just set up to really manage static situations or linear situations. It is always engaged with everything that we do. And that's an important facet to know, that everything that we take in, everything that we see, we hear, we touch, we taste, we smell, and all the other data that we gather, our brain has to process it and creates a response to it. That's how powerful our brains are. So understanding the power within our brain, we understand why when our brain doesn't work well, everything doesn't work well. So looking at in terms of mental health, part of our mental health journey is understanding our human condition. And understanding our human condition is one of these things that really give us an indication of what we can and can't control. And there are 5 stated things in our human experience that we cannot control. And when we understand those and accept those, it allows us to respond better. Remember, going back to our brain is a master organ that elicits our response to everything. And so when we understand what we can't control, our brain can elicit a more appropriate response than one that believes it can control everything. So let's talk about the 5 things that we can't control. First thing we can't control is this. We have to understand this. Everything changes and ends. There's a beginning to everything and an end to everything, and everything changes. So our ability to adapt to change is critical for our mental health. This is where I talked before about the brain being dynamic in nature. If the brain was static and didn't allow for change, we'd be living in a place where all of us would understand the rhythm and cadence of life, and it wouldn't upset the apple cart at all. But because everything is changing and that life is dynamic, it means that we have to adapt. And the better we adapt to change, the better we understand that, through time, things end and new things start. It allows a better transition in both our mental health state and our well-being, and our ability to prepare for this and adapt. One of the things that is uniquely human is our ability to adapt. And that adaptation, that ability to adapt, really is infused in this knowledge that everything changes, and our understanding and belief to know that we have to ready ourselves for that subsequent change. So we have to know that. That's the first thing. The second thing we have to know is things don't always go according to plan. So my mom, and probably your mom, always told you, if you fail to prepare, you prepare to fail. So have a plan. And really, we know the most successful circumstances, the most successful people always have a moniker of planning that takes place. It's germane to what we know to be successful. But even in the most ardent planning, things always don't go according to the plan. And then it's time for us then to be able to adapt, to be basically have a plan B or plan C or plan D, because things don't always go according to plan. We see people suffering from a lot of mental health crises because of the fact that they're not adapting or don't have a plan B or a plan C. And one of the things that's germane to this world is things don't always go according to plan. Think about the last time you drove to work and you left at a certain time, anticipating you were going to get to work at a certain time. Something happened on the way to work. There was traffic, there was a car accident up ahead, you got a flat tire. All of those things predicate things not going to scale. But our role is to be able to adapt. If we cumulatively keep on not being able to have a plan B or a plan C, it does start to creep in on our mental health and our well-being. So these are things that we can't change. The next thing that we have to understand, that life isn't always fair. Life isn't always fair. As much as we'd love to see justice be vetted out in every single situation, the way the world is, it's just an impossibility. And so there's going to be an amount of things that aren't fair that happen to all of us. And our ability to be able to have resilience in the face of things that aren't fair is critical to our mental health and our well-being. So we have to understand that we're not always going to be on the even side of everything that transpires. We also need to know this: pain is a part of life. And that's a fact. None of us get through this life without experiencing pain, physical pain, emotional pain, you name it. And it's our ability to cope with the painful parts of our life that oftentimes allow us to be in better mental health, better well-being, and better overall health. Understanding this principle is huge, because a lot of us sometimes almost blissfully, innocently, are trying to live life without the prospect of pain touching us. And that's just an impossibility. So understanding that it's a part of life and being able to put a support system and to gird yourself for pain that we're all going to experience at some point plays a tremendous ability in the effect of us being able to walk through positive mental health. And then lastly, the fifth is that people aren't going to always be loving and loyal. And that's just a truth in life. We would love to be able to depend on those who are in our inner circle and those who are around us all the time and expect their loyalty and their love and all of those things. But that's just not true all the time. And so part of our ability to adapt is to understand this and to be able to allow for some grace and to be able to surround ourselves with the right skills and the right people to get us through those times of disappointment when the people that we depend on don't meet our expectations. So understanding those are the principles that we have to understand that help us get through periods where our mental health is challenged, or understanding these things allow us to have realistic expectations so that certain aspects of mental health don't become accelerated or exacerbated. So with that, we know that our mental and emotional health is not random. It's not random in nature. There's always something, there's things in nature and in science called cause and effect. There are things that are there that are part of the picture of our mental health. And in this day and age, we see so much about our mental health. Our mental health is everywhere. And it's one of the most important bedrocks for our total overall health. There was a point in time when people were told to have a stiff upper lip and to never let their emotions show. And regardless of the trauma that you've experienced in life, you need to just play like it never happened. And we saw a lot of people suffer from adverse mental health throughout their life. And so again, mental health is just not random. There are things that spur it on. So let's talk about a few of those things that are part of that continuum that that are there. So there is a genetic inheritance component to mental health. And this genetic inheritance is really important. We know that if there are family members, specifically first degree family members, mother, father, sister, brother, that have depression or are prone to anxiety, things along those lines, that genetic information is passed down to other first degree relatives. So this is something that's good to know about your family history. Are there people in your family history that do suffer from depression or anxiety or other types of mental health illnesses? Because it's important to know this, because this is part of the proactivity that needs to take place for us to be able to mitigate what we see in terms of the outcomes of mental health. So for example, if I had a father who is prone to depression and really had these bluesy periods that caused him to withdraw, and I knew this and I saw this, my obligation is to make sure that I get on top of this. One, I'm going to give some strategies a little later on in terms of mental health, but to really start to practice those strategies and to become into a community so that my genetic inheritance doesn't take over where I am right now. So understand that there is genetic inheritance involved. This is a graph looking at genetic markers, and some of those are pertaining to mental illness. And then who you are, that matters. We know that men and women respond to mental health differently. And so who you are matters. Your gender matters. Your age matters. We know that young people have a disproportionate amount of peer pressure that amps up their mental health difficulty at a very young age, specifically now in the age of social media and things like that, where they're depending on likes and things like that to create self-esteem. And if it's not there, they become depressed and they're full of anxiety, and mental health comes. And so age is a factor. And then we start to look at ethnicity. We know that there's certain ethnicities who are at disproportional risk for things like mental illness, things based on appearance or body image or perceived characteristics. All of those things can really elevate the amount of mental health issues that someone has. So who you are makes a big difference in terms of your mental health. And then we have where you live. So understanding we have different cities, different regions, different states, different parts of the country that have these elevated pockets of mental health and lack of well-being in that area. And it's because of a lot of what transpires there. And so where you live makes a big difference in terms of your ability to cope or not cope, or what community you live in, or does this community have resources, and so on and so forth. And so where you live makes a big difference in terms of your mental health. We know this to be true. People who live in the Pacific Northwest and some parts of the Northeast, specifically during winter time, we see the aspect that they have disproportionate rates of things like seasonal affective disorder, SAD. And SAD, or seasonal affective disorder, is a type of mental illness that comes around when you're not exposed to sunlight for extended periods of time. You have a lack of vitamin D, and it has more depressive or bluesy types of things. And so where you live matters in terms of your mental health. And then of course, your access to healthcare. Healthcare access is one of those things that is a trigger all the way around. And when I say it's a trigger all the way around, statistically, those who have better access to healthcare typically do better in a whole lot of areas in terms of their ability to be able to get the care that they need. So access to healthcare is a huge, huge indicator whether someone stays in a state of depression or anxiety or high mental health or not. We see this in communities of color, where there's not a lot of access to mental health care or access to a lot of the supporting systems. And so therefore, there's a lot of undiagnosed rates of mental health and mental illness because of that. And so it's this lack of access to healthcare. That's one of the issues. And then, of course, our health behaviors are issues in terms of the disproportionate rate of who then is affected by mental health. We know that there's things that we can do that give us a reduction in our risk for mental health. I talked about even just a slide before in terms of having sunlight, something like that. And that's a health behavior, getting outside and not being inside all the time, moving our body, eating the right foods. There's a lot of things, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that later in terms of the strategies associated with this type of behaviors associated with mental health. So understanding this principle, our bodies were created to be in balance. And when we're talking about mental health is an example of our body being out of balance due to a lot of what we just talked about before. One, those 5 things that we can't control, and 2, those things that are part of our environment, things like that, that get our bodies out of balance. And when I started off my presentation, I talked about the brain and this wonderful metabolic organ that controls and processes everything. And so when our bodies are out of balance, specifically our brain, it's not able to perform all of the functions that it was created and designed to do. It could be anything from the way that we process enzymes and proteins and chemicals, and we're going to talk about that in just a little bit. All of those things go awry. And so when it's unable to process and do all of those things and perform those functions, and it becomes out of balance, one of the outcomes is mental illness or mental health aspects. The other is physical illnesses. We see the physical manifestation of mental health. We start seeing the physiological aspects. We see an increased heart rate, which we call tachycardia. People start to get diaphoretic and sweaty when they start to be under stress or having extreme mental health. We start seeing people blood pressure rise. All of these types of illnesses are related to this lack of control of our mental health functions. And then our body starts to physically break down. Our body starts to physically break down because our brains and everything like that is out of balance. And so our body starts to break down in a number of ways. We become more apt to other disease states. And we start looking at this chronic fatigue and pain. We start to see that happen in a lot of people. They're always tired. They have no energy. All of a sudden, their pain receptors are hypersensitive, and it's all starting to break down. And it's part of the whole mental illness and the mental health continuum. And then we get into this area of cognitive difficulties. So one of the things that we know is that our mental health affects our cognitive health. And I'll talk about that in a slide coming up. Is the fact that when we're out of balance mentally or struggling with our mental health, our cognitive health starts to go down a negative path as well. And this happens to young people all the way up to older people. And then we start to exhibit addictive behavior, because when our brains are out of balance, we seek balance in oftentimes negative places. So if all of a sudden I'm feeling out of sorts and I feel a little lonely or something like that, I will look for destructive ways or addictive ways to sometimes give me the feeling that I wanted before. So we see things like addiction be part of the continuum as well, with our body struggling to get back into balance. So looking at the brain, going back, we know that our neurotransmitters, which are these chemicals in our brain that are responsible for the communication of all the information, all the data that we're taking in from our body, gets communicated through these neurotransmitters. And so there's some major neurotransmitters. There's one, serotonin, which is responsible for our contentment, satisfaction, our energy, our happiness. All of those types of things come from serotonin. Remember I said when things are out of balance, other things don't work well? So when our serotonin becomes out of balance because of our mental health issues, all of a sudden, when we previously were happy, we're no longer happy. So happiness comes. I lose interest in things that I previously had interest in just because of my levels of serotonin aren't balanced anymore. And then, whereas normally satisfied, I become dissatisfied and I start to exhibit a behavior and attitudes of being dissatisfied. And that's this whole mental health continuum playing over and over solely because of this lack of serotonin, because my body is out of balance. My brain is out of balance. Then we have norepinephrine, another neurotransmitter, and that's our stress hormone, our fight or flight response. And so this starts to get triggered unnecessarily because of the fact that our body has these, what we call higher circulating levels of cortisol, which is our stress hormone. And it fires into norepinephrine, which is our neurotransmitter that's responsible for that as well. So you have this engagement of this neurotransmitter at times where it shouldn't be engaged. We then start to live in this excited state of hyperactivity and hyper stress, and our bodies can't sustain being in that hyper stress mode. And so all of a sudden it starts to create neuroinflammation. It starts to create our body breaking down. Right now, we live these incredibly stressful lives all the time. You're worried about your money. You're worried about your kids. You're worried about politics. You're worried about everything you can think of. We start to worry about. And that has this excited rate of cortisol and norepinephrine firing the wrong way. And our mental health becomes really accelerated because of this. And then we have dopamine. And dopamine is another neurotransmitter that helps control our reward and our pleasure and helps regulate all of the things that we do, movement and things like addiction that we talked about before. So when dopamine gets interfered with this out of balance aspect, we get into this state of always trying to please the pleasure centers of our brain with artificial things that aren't natural. So typically, our brain gets a great reward when we walk around the block. Our brain fills with oxygen. We have all of this dump of all the pleasure centers of our brain, and that's just a natural feeling of being rewarded. We look to fill it artificially because of our stress. So you guys have probably heard of people who are stressful eaters. When they're stressed out, they start to eat, and it starts to the reward center becomes a little out of control because yes, when we eat, oh man, our tongue sends this message to our brain that says the food is so delicious, and it gives us this pleasure in our minds. But all of a sudden, when we're stressed out, are the dopamine receptors that typically give us the pleasure stuff. We're looking for artificial pleasure. And so we eat and eat and eat to get this pleasure because we're otherwise depressed. And we end up with an addiction, and we end up with being really out of balance because of that, because our body is looking for ways to try and get the pleasure that it can't get because of the stress that's going on in our brains and in our body. So let's talk a little bit about stress since we started talking about stress here. So stress is our reaction to pressure, and all of us are going to have pressure. You know, the Bible clearly says in this life you will have trouble. So we're going to have stress, and we're going to have some trouble. But stress is our way that we react to pressure. We need to find an appropriate reaction to the pressure that we have. Not all pressure is bad. We need a certain amount of pressure to be able to get up in the morning and to have a great day at work and do all of those things. Not all pressure is bad, but when we have an abnormal reaction to pressure or too much pressure, that's when things get out of balance, like we talked about. So we need to be able to adapt to the right amount of pressure. And when we do that, we'll have a normal amount of stress. But this is where things become abnormal, because typically what we see now is we're not adapting well to any of the stress that's around us. Our 24-hour news cycle, so many things going on in the world that we have a maladaptation to stress, and that creates this mental health continuum that we start to see transpiring. So this fact here is true. We are what we focus on, meaning that our reaction to the stresses that happen are extremely important. We are what we focus on. So if we focus on what's wrong, we start to go down a negative continuum. And this negative continuum takes us to a place where we're maladapted to stress. But if we focus on what works, it takes us to this area that we have more strength in terms of what we do, and we can have more meaning, and we can engage. So we are what we focus on. And these are some skills that we have to learn. You ever see some negative Nellies and Donald Downers out there that focus on the wrong thing that can really influence our mood? And if we get too many of them, it starts to create an atmosphere of stress because we're focusing on the wrong thing. And so science has looked at this. When we focus on the wrong things, it takes us to languishing, which is the left side of the continuum. And if we keep on doing it, that's when mental health starts to creep into the picture. The more we focus on what we can't control, we talked about earlier, the things that we need to accept and the things that we need to control, the more we focus on those negative things, it takes us down that continuum where the only result is mental health, mental illness. We have to focus on what works and what we can control, which is part of the continuum that takes us to flourishing. Lots of research has been done this, that we control the way that our mind perceives things. So what we have to do is reframe things. If we take someone's reframing for us, someone frames something for us, and we take their framing as the way that it needs to be, those are those Debbie Downers and so on and so forth. We tend to shift that way. It's up to us to look at every situation individually and frame it the way that it needs to be so that we can flourish, as opposed to go down this road of mental health, where we seem to be headed a lot of people. So the benefits of seeking help, specifically when you start to see yourself having some difficulty, and all of us have difficulty. Sometimes the pressure comes at a time when you're not expecting it, you can't handle it, and we all need to seek help. And there's distinct benefits of that. One, better physical health. We know that it strengthens our immune system, and help comes in many forms. It comes in being able to confide with somebody, to go seek any type of intervention. It comes from a lot of forms, and we'll talk about some of those in a few minutes towards the end of my presentation. So we know that overall, seeking help will help your overall health. And then, in terms on the personal side, you'll have increased energy and flow. And part of what we see in the mental health continuum is this almost sedentary magnetism where you can't take the next step. When you seek help, it creates activity. And that's what you want. Every day, creating activity, creating flow, which increases your self-confidence and self-efficacy for you to be able to cope with all of the stressors. Because here's the thing, I'd love to tell you today that all your stressors will all stop for the rest of your life. That only happens if you die. So if you want to continue to live, you are going to have stress. So we have to learn how to cope appropriately with our stress. So here's some mental health facts that we need to understand. So we know mental health can take many forms. I talked about stress, but there's depression, and there's bipolar, and there's schizophrenia, and there's the eating disorders when we have malordered eating, and then anxiety and phobias, and we have the abuse or the addictions that I talked about before. And then we have post-traumatic stress disorders, when we see something that is seared into the neural grooves of our brain that play over and over that affect us in a negative way. And then we have things like grief and things that lead to what we call a dementia process along the way. All of these are in the continuum of mental health. A lot of times we just always said mental health is just a little depression, a little anxiety. It's much bigger than that. It's much more complex. And a lot of people don't realize that they're suffering from mental health because the definition has been so narrow and so negative that nobody wants to own this. And I'm here to tell everybody, it's a normal part of our lives. It's a normal part of our lives. It's about getting through it, not languishing in it. It's getting through it. So that's just a part of life. And so part of the other facts is people always feel uncomfortable talking about mental health, like it's some type of bad word. And if it remains to be that bad word, then nothing is going to happen in a positive way. And so we've stigmatized it. So now we need to take off the stereotypical aspects. I'm telling all of us, we all suffer from mental health at some point in our life, and sometimes repeatedly throughout our life, because life's not easy. Let's face it. There's a lot of unintended things that happen to us that we need to process and takes us through this whole deal. Everybody wants to believe that it could never be me. I'm here to tell you, it is you. It is your family members. It's all of us, but we need to be able to come together and work through those things. So here's some facts. All mental health can be helped by support. And support is a big word and a small word. Support could mean, a spouse, a sibling, a friend, and it could also mean bigger. It could mean a church, a community, a village. It could mean a lot of things, but you need to get it outside of you. That's the key. It can't be a singular thing. Support is plural. Therapy and counseling, wonderful ways to be able to process everything from PTSD to trauma to all sorts of things, or even just a bad boss, an unrealistic workload that all of a sudden has you under the weight of every day going into a job that you hate, but you have to do because you need to bring money home. And that's an imbalance we talked about earlier, this lack of balance. And so, we know that you can go on to live very, very engaging, productive lives when you seek the support. And sometimes support has to come get you before you start to self-destruct. And so when support has to come get you because it recognizes that you're out of balance, don't resist, because we all need that help. We're all part of a bigger process. So, okay, so practical aspects. How do we practice good mental health? First thing is how we treat our bodies. How we treat our bodies. That's something under our control. How we treat our bodies. So we need to drink well and eat well. A lot of information on that. I'm going to give you a little bit more in just a quick second. But that's one of the things that we need to do. Don't neglect those things. Sleep is one of the most important things that we can do. It has to be an appropriate amount of sleep. Some of us get too little sleep because stress interrupts our sleep. Some of us get too much sleep because depression puts us to sleep, but we don't want to face the world. So there's a sweet spot that we all need to get good sleep. A number of important things happen when we sleep. One, cellular recovery happens when we sleep, meaning throughout the day, our cells get, used and worn and go through the ringer to keep us how we are. While we sleep, cellular repair happens. This is when all of our cells get repaired and get ready to rock and roll for the next day to serve you really well. The other thing that happens when you sleep is memory formation. All of the information that you've taken in through all of your senses, what you've seen, smelled, heard, tasted, and touched, all of that gets consolidated in from your short-term memories and gets consolidated to your long-term memories while you sleep. Your brain sorts out what's important to keep, what's important to slough off, and reinforces a lot of those memories while you sleep. If you don't get adequate sleep, none of that happens. And so people end up with cognitive problems, scrambled brains, fried brains, foggy headedness because of that, which then start into a greater portion of the mental illness, mental health aspects. Our bodies were created to move. We got to move our bodies at the end of the day. It is one of the ways that we perfuse our brains is by moving our body. The left ventricle of our heart pumps fresh oxygenated blood to the rest of our body, specifically our brain, because what I told you earlier, our brain is the most metabolic organ in our entire body. So when we're not active, It not only affects our heart health, but it affects our brain health and our mental health. It's all part of the continuum. And then we need to move with intention, meaning we have to plan and create a routine every day. Purpose is huge. Purpose is one of the big reasons that we're able to be who we are. But you have to be able to do that. People who are suffering from mental health crises and things like that, that's one of the areas that they're weak in, that need some help, is that purpose and planning and intention and creating that routine that they can work through those issues still in a productive way. And then, of course, asking for help. If it's not easily recognizable by others, you got to raise your hand and say, I need some help. And that's typically the first step in terms of what others may not be able to see that's transpiring in you being out of balance in some capacity. So in terms of looking at what to eat and things like that, we know the Western diet, high saturated fat, few vegetables, all of those things, they do us damage in terms of keeping our brains healthy. It increases inflammation in the brain, neuroinflammation. It increases oxidative stress in the brain and decreases the hippocampal volume, which is the seat of our memory in our hippocampus of our brain. So we need to change our diet so that we can flip the script, because eating healthy will create a better foundation for our mental health and our overall brain health and everything like that. So at the end of the day, mental health affects all of us. It also affects our cognitive status. If we have mental health issues, we can't remember anything. And it's specifically if you start to become an older adult, mental health and cognitive health are intrinsically wound together. So when I do memory screenings on people, cognitive screenings on people, one of the things that we do to tease out to see if it's a real cognitive issue or not is we do some type of depression and mental health screening, so make sure that that's not masking itself as the cognitive condition that we see. That's how intrinsically linked they are. Mental health and cognitive health are linked together. So we want to be able to tease all that stuff out and be able to really get to the bottom of what's happening. So that is really where we're at in terms of looking at mental health, well-being, and cognitive health. Anybody have any questions for me as we close out right on time here? Anyone have any questions? Okay, great, good.
I'm sorry, my name is Pat Cook, and I have one in the chat box I put in there about how much sleep we should be getting.
Oh, so we're talking in terms of regular adults should be getting at least 7 hours of sleep. Senior adults add another hour to that, at least 8 hours of sleep. And we're talking about consistent, sustained sleep. Now, I'm not silly enough to think that not everybody will get up at certain times of the night and use the restroom or anything like that. But as long as they get back and have more of a sustained sleep than a broken up sleep, you want to have that REM sleep. So sleep is a really important aspect, like I mentioned before.
So that broken up sleep during the time you're sleeping could cause something to happen to you as far as your cognitiveness, or what?
So like I said, yeah, memory formation happens while you sleep. And so again, the recommendation is sustained sleep. So the more broken up sleep you have, the more you put yourself at risk for that type of mind fog that happens with lack of overall consistent sleep.
Okay.
And there's